This is the $150 7-inch FPV drone, but I've made a couple of upgrades. I've changed the camera to a AKK TX5000 to get a little more detail. I swapped the props to these bi-bladed ones for better efficiency, but the biggest upgrade of them all is the video transmitter. The original one topped out at 1.6 watts, which is pretty good, but this new one is even better. It's not 2 watts, it's not 3 watts, this is the 5-watt video transmitter from AKK. Yeah, 5 watts of output power is crazy. I've never owned any VTX this powerful. And that's not the only special feature it has, because this is a wideband VTX. Normal VTXs operate only in the 5.8 GHz range, but this AKK one has frequencies as low as 4.9 GHz and as high as 6 GHz. And to fill up this wide range, it comes programmed with 96 different channels, which is double the normal amount of channels. Why would you want all these extra frequencies and high output power? I can't go into too much detail, but if for some reason there's a lot of interference and jamming in the common 5.8 GHz frequencies, then you could get around that interference by using a more uncommon 4.9 GHz channel. These lower frequencies do require a specially tuned antenna, but AKK makes these as well. You can see the white antenna is the 5.8 GHz antenna, but the black antenna is the 5 GHz antenna meant for these lower frequencies. For me though, I'll stick to the normal 5.8 GHz range. Also, big shout out to AKK for sending me this video transmitter and antennas to try out. And fun fact, all of the analog video footage you've ever seen on this channel is recorded through an AKK diversity receiver module that I bought a few years back. Their modules are also how you would receive these weird frequencies like the 4.9 GHz ones. Their latest ones are programmed to be wideband to match their VTXs. And so let's take this out on a test flight on the 7-inch drone. If you haven't already seen it, I made a video on how to build a 7-inch drone for $150. It's a really good starting point in FPV drone building, and it works as a really good test bed for projects and experiments just like this one. The main view you're seeing is from a GoPro Hero 8, and at the bottom right is the goggles DVR footage from the AKK receiver. That's what I'm seeing when I'm flying. A lot of the on-screen display elements are wrong, so don't pay them too much attention. I finally figured out why the current sensor on the drone wasn't working properly. It turns out it came from the factory without one installed in the first place. Apparently the current sensor chip costs around $1 each, which is pretty expensive in terms of the entire ESC, which sells for around $20. So the factory is making these without the current sensor installed. I ended up buying one for $1 and soldering it in myself, but it's a tiny little surface mount chip, and I don't think I soldered it in properly because I'm getting some current readings, but it's really inconsistent. Now let's put the GoPro footage aside and let's take a closer look at the video quality coming into the goggles. AKK really knows what they're doing when designing RF video circuitry, because this combination of their AKK transmitter, the AKK receiver module, and the CADX Retel 2 camera, it's producing the cleanest analog video footage I've ever seen. This isn't being recorded on the drone, this is the analog video signal coming in wirelessly into my goggles, and I was just blown away about how clear it was. And on top of that, this is the farthest I've ever flown any FPV drone. I normally never fly into the forest since it would be really difficult to recover a crashed drone there. And I guess after saying that, I kind of realized how silly that sounds considering I do a lot of my flying over the pond. But anyways, the really strong and clear video signal gave me the confidence to fly out into the forest, and it performed perfectly. Interestingly, when I'm flying closer to myself, sometimes I get these diagonal bands in the video feed. I think that's from the receiver switching to the Omni receiver antenna, and when I'm flying farther away, like right now, it switches to the patch antenna, which actually produces a cleaner signal. So I guess I'll have to find a better Omni antenna to get rid of that diagonal banding when I'm flying closer to myself. Also, please kind of excuse my boring flying for the next bit here. Since this is my first time flying this deep in the forest, I never noticed that a path in the trees has been cleared away, starting from the highway and going pretty far in, and it kind of follows the creek a little. I don't know what they're doing here. Are they planning to make a road or maybe room for power lines? I'm not sure, but it must have been pretty expensive to clear away all of those trees. Now let's get into some of the quirks of the system. With all these features comes a little bit of complicated setup. Betaflight, which is the software that the drone runs on, is designed to handle a typical 48-channel VTX and not this 96-channel one, and that means by default, Betaflight can only switch between the first 48 channels, which unfortunately my usual channel, which is channel A6 in the 5.8 GHz range, it's unavailable. I think there's some kind of workaround way in the Betaflight CLI to get around this, but I never figured that out. Instead, I manually set the VTX to channel A6 by using the button on the VTX. Also, changing power levels is supported natively by Betaflight, but there's a little quirk with that too. I normally use low power disarm. That means when I plug in the battery into the drone, by default it goes into low power mode on the VTX, and then when I arm the drone in order to go fly, Betaflight switches the VTX to a higher power level. This way, when I'm just setting things up on the ground, I'm not blasting out full video power. This low power disarm does work with the AKK video transmitter, but when switching from low to high power, the video feed cuts out for about half of a second. I think what it's doing is that it's turning on some kind of power amplifier that takes a moment to fully power on. This won't affect too many people, but some people do switch power levels mid-flight. You can set that up in Betaflight. You don't want to do that with this VTX due to it cutting out when you switch the power levels. I'm probably going to end up just disabling low power disarm entirely and just going full power all the time, and this VTX should be fine because it has an active cooling fan that should keep all the temperatures under control. Overall, if you want a really nice and clean analog video setup, I'd highly recommend AKK video receivers, and now that I've tried one of their transmitters for the first time, I'm happy to recommend them as well. Also, you may have noticed that my usual beat-up plastic tabletop is gone. A desk company called Flexispot offered to replace my old desk with one of their new electric standing desks. These desks have an electric motor and a control panel that lets you control the height of the desk, and it has 4 memory presets as well. I think what I'm going to end up doing is getting one of those walking pad treadmills and putting that under the desk so I can edit videos and exercise at the same time while the desk is set to high. And then when I'm tired, I can set the desk back to a sitting level. I love sharing the FPV drone hobby with these videos, which means that most of the time is actually spent in front of a computer trying to learn how to edit videos. So hopefully this desk can help me move around a little bit more. This desk they sent me is their EN1 model, and it's available on Amazon for pretty cheap. And funnily enough, I already had this in my save for later section of my Amazon cart, because I was already in the market for a better desk to film my videos on, and they're the first result when you look up standing desk on Amazon. I think that's because they're affordable, but they still have a nice, solid, single-piece tabletop, unlike a lot of the other cheaper standing desks that split the top part into 2 parts, which has a slightly little gap and seam into them. So overall, big shout out to Flexispot for sending me this desk.